Okay, so first argument. Is the following argument valid? If the sun is a star, then it is hot. The sun is a star, so it is hot. Not a very interesting argument, but yes, it's valid. The first premise is a conditional. It says that the sun's being a star would be enough to make it hot, and the second premise tells us that the sun is a star, and it would follow from that it's hot. So if you said valid, it was correct. Second argument, argument B, is also fairly straightforward. Either Professor Plum or Miss Scarlett committed the murder. Professor Plum did not commit the murder, so Miss Scarlett committed it. If you said this one was valid, you were correct. Again, seems fairly straightforward. The first premise gives us two options. The second premise rules out the first of the two options, and so it follows that the Miss Scarlett committed it. The second option is correct. So that's clearly valid. Example C, is the following argument valid? All US presidents have been human beings. All men are human beings, so all US presidents have been men. Now this one is perhaps a little trickier, but you should have said that it's invalid. Even though everything in the argument is true, sadly, nevertheless, it's not valid because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. You have to use your imagination a bit. Perhaps start by imagining that the conclusion is false. Imagine that we have had a US president who has not been a man. So, for example, imagine that Hillary Clinton became president in 2016. In that case, you could still imagine that the premises are true. It's still true that all US presidents have been human. It's still true that all men are human. But in that scenario, we have a female president, so the conclusion is false. So the premises don't force one to believe the conclusion. If you believe the premises, you can quite consistently reject the conclusion. So let's turn now to, you have an argument D, which is not on one of these slides, that says, if the intruder was a stranger, the dog would have barked. The dog did not bark, so the intruder was not a stranger. And that one, again, is valid. If we understand the first premise to say that the intruder's being a stranger would be enough to make the dog bark, and then we know that the dog didn't bark, then we can infer that the intruder was not a stranger. Now consider example E, which is a little closer to the subject matter of our class. If God existed, the world would be perfect, but the world is not perfect, so God does not exist. Again, you might disagree with the first premise, but you should be able to see that this argument is valid, that if those premises are true, the conclusion would be true too. So now here's something interesting. Think about D and E. Think about what D and E have in common. Both of them start out with an if-then statement. Both of them have as a second premise a not statement and then a negation, and then they conclude with a not. Now, and in fact, there's a kind of pattern, right? The thing that is negated in the second premise is the second half of the conditional. The thing that is negated in the conclusion is the first half of the conditional, the first premise. So there's a kind of pattern, and we can represent that pattern with letters in place of the component clauses. So here we have if P, then Q, not Q, so not P. Now, this argument form is always valid. That is to say, if you, whatever you put in place of P and Q, as long as the same thing in place of P throughout and the same thing in place of Q throughout, and as long as what's put in place of P and what's put in place of Q are each coherent, what could be a coherent sentence, then you have a valid argument. And the technical name of this form of argument is known as modus tollens. So if you see an argument that has this form, no matter what content you put in there, you could say it's valid because it's modus tollens. If you study logic, you will learn that there are a number of different famous forms, famous patterns that are always valid. Here's another one. If you look at argument A on your course packet, it has the form if P, then Q, P, so Q. And arguments that have this form are always valid also. And the name of this form of argument is modus ponens. You don't need to remember those names, but just be aware of this idea of argument forms and some of them being valid. Argument B above, the one about Miss Scarlett, could be represented as this form, either P or Q, not P, so Q. And arguments in this form are always valid. This form of argument is known as disjunctive syllogism. If you study logic, you would learn about 20 of these different forms, but we're not going to do that. Okay, let's turn to example F from the course packet. Is the following argument valid? If the fetus is a person, then abortion is wrong. The fetus is not a person, so abortion is not wrong. Now, you might have been tempted to say that this one was valid, and you might now think that perhaps this is another example of modus tollens. But in fact, it's not quite an example of modus tollens. So, for example, this is the form of this argument. If P, then Q, not P, so not Q. Right? Remember, modus tollens was if P, then Q, not Q, so not P. Now, you might think, well, that's a pretty trivial difference, just two letters switched, but it actually makes quite a lot of difference. So here, let's go back. We can think of a counterexample. Now, counterexample is an example that has the form of this argument and where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So here would be a counterexample. If there's fire in the room, there's oxygen in the room. That seems right, that you can't have fire without oxygen. So if there were a fire in the room that you were sitting in right now, there would be oxygen there to keep it going. We could add that there is no fire in the room. If there is a fire, you better get out of there and not worry about this lecture. And then the conclusion is that there is not oxygen in the room. Again, presumably, if that's true, then you're in trouble. So these premises are true, and the conclusion is false, and this argument fits the form of the abortion argument. So there's something wrong with an argument. It's an invalid argument form. So the argument about abortion is not of a valid argument form. And you might just think about it a little bit and think about the particular argument and recognize that this argument probably not valid because somebody could believe the premises and reject the conclusion without contradicting herself. She could believe that abortion was wrong if the fetus is a person, and also believe that abortion would also be wrong if the fetus was a mere potential person. If she then went on to believe that the fetus is not a person, she might still believe that abortion was wrong. So somebody could believe those premises and reject the conclusion without in any way contradicting herself. Argument G and argument H are examples of arguments where there's a missing premise. The person who's written it seems to be assuming an extra premise, but they haven't bothered to tell us what it is. This is a fairly common phenomenon when you're reading stories and papers and editorials, and it's a good exercise to be able to think of what would fill in the blank. Think of an extra premise that would make the argument valid. So, for example, this one, God created us, so God has the right to decide what happens to us. By itself, this is not valid, but we can make it valid by adding in an extra premise. And there are at least two possible premises you could have added. One is you could say simply, if God created us, then God has the right to decide what happens to us. That would make it an example of modus ponens. Or you could say something more general, like if someone creates something, then he or she has the right to decide what happens to it. Both of those would make for a valid argument. So we should talk a little bit about some things to know about valid arguments. Some valid arguments have false premises and a false conclusion. Remember, being valid and having true premises are different things. So we have seen examples like this. We saw the example of everything Trump says is true. Trump says London is the capital of France, so London is the capital of France. That is an argument with false premises and a false conclusion. Some valid arguments have false premises and a true conclusion. That's a little bit harder to come up with an example, but think about this one. Everything Trump says is true. Trump says that you are taking philosophy 113, so you are taking philosophy 113. This argument is valid. If the premises were true, the conclusion would be true, but presumably the premises are all false, and it has a true conclusion. Some valid arguments have true premises and a true conclusion. That's, of course, what we're looking for. The argument about the sun and the star would fit that model. No valid arguments have all true premises and a false conclusion. This one is this is the only case, the only kind of argument that you cannot have, and this follows from the definition of a valid argument. A valid argument is one in which, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So you cannot have a valid argument with all true premises and a false conclusion. You can, however, have an invalid argument with all true premises and a true conclusion. The example about the presidents would be a good example of that. It is possible to tell whether an argument is valid or invalid without knowing whether the premises or conclusion are true or false. Yes, it is possible to do that. And you can see that with the example B, the example about Professor Plum. You don't know who Professor Plum is, who Miss Scarlett is, but you can see that that's a valid argument, because if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. You don't know whether any of it's true, but you do know that there's this right sort of relationship between the premises and the conclusion, such that if the premises were true, the conclusion would be true. So you sort of use your imagination to try to see if you can come up with a scenario where the premises are true and the conclusion false, a possible scenario. And if you can't, that's a good indication that the argument is valid. I'm going to stop now, take a couple minutes break, and come back and talk about soundness and